Today is part 2 on playoff team X Factors, going over the Eastern Conference. If you have not checked it out already, part 1 going over the Western Conference X Factors is out. It's the most recent video before this one, so go check that out if you have not already. With that out of the way, my definition of an X Factor is just like the guy who can go one way or the other on a team, and that will be a huge factor in whether they win. A guy who usually tends to be inconsistent, can have a good series or a bad series, and whether or not they have one of those can determine how good the series for their team overall ends up being. So, yeah, that's it. That's pretty self-explanatory. So, intro. Before I continue on with this video, about half of the people that watch these videos are not subscribed, so if you fall under that 50%, then subscribe. Also drop a like on this video. It only takes 1 second and it makes a massive difference. Also, there is a new episode of the podcast out now. Go check that out if you have not already. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the X Factor for the Philadelphia 76ers, which in my opinion, sadly has to be their second best player, Ben Simmons. Ben does not have the best track record in the playoffs thus far in his career because teams really exploit his biggest weakness in the playoffs, which is shooting. The best way to avoid this for Ben would be to play more aggressively and to be good off ball cutting and things like that, when really in the past when he is relegated to not having the ball, he just kind of stands there, especially in like the dunker spot, which is not ideal next to Joel Embiid because you want to give him the most space possible. So how Ben adapts to defenses really sagging off of him even more than they already do, it will really determine how far the Sixers can go, because the past couple of times they've done it, it's really hurt the team. For the Brooklyn Nets, I'm going to go Nicholas Claxton. He is a name that's been brought up a lot lately as he has been breaking out for the Nets. I think he is going to be really good for them in the playoffs, but he is very young, and this is the first time in his career where he's really getting real minutes. So to put him in the situation where you're going from bench role where you play 5 minutes a game to you are the starting center on a contender in a team in the East where you have to face Joel Embiid, that's a pretty tall task. So he is going to be a big factor for them defensively, and if he can hold up under those circumstances, it's going to be a huge addition for the team. For the Milwaukee Bucks, I'm going to go with Dante DiVincenzo. He has actually been a lot better for the Bucks than I expected this year. In fact, he's been so good that I would argue that not trading for Bogdan Bogdanovic really wasn't that big of a deal in the long run, because I think that he is quite good right now. But every time I watch a Bucks game, Dante either has a good game or a bad game. It's rare that he has a mediocre game. For me, it seems like he's rather inconsistent. He'll have games where he's shooting very well from 3, games where he's shooting very poorly from 3. So if he has a good series throughout an entire series, especially against some of the best teams in the NBA, Dante could be a huge piece for the Bucks, or he could be relegated to a guy who really is just playing solid defense and missing his open threes, which is not what you want next to Giannis, because we've seen in playoff series in the past, when Giannis's teammates stop making their threes, Giannis really becomes ineffective. So hopefully he doesn't do that. For the Knicks, I'm gonna go with RJ Barrett, mostly because I couldn't really think of anybody else, and if I had to choose a player on the Knicks who is the most inconsistent, even if RJ is the second best player on the team, it would be RJ, simply because he's young and his shooting is not the most reliable. He has games where he shoots poorly, and that's perfectly fine. It's to be expected with a second-year player, but going into a playoff series, I think it's very well possible that RJ has a not great series just because of that, and teams try to exploit his relatively poor shooting. Like, I understand he's shooting like 39% from 3 right now, but on that low of a volume and it being pretty much exclusive open catch and shoots, that's not actually that great of a 3-point shooter. Like, we've seen something like that with Al-Farouq Aminu in Portland, where teams were leaving him open despite having similar regular season shooting numbers to RJ. Your percentage and your attempts does not always equate to how good of a shooter you actually are, and teams are still going to be leaving RJ open, and him actually knocking down those threes will make a big difference for New York, but it's it's really just, we're just gonna have to wait and see if it actually happens. For the Hawks, I'm gonna go with Kevin Huerter. He actually doesn't really have bad games all too often. I have noticed he usually has just okay games or really good games. The other day he had a really good game with 20+ points. I think if he could have a series where he's really putting in buckets, that is going to make a big difference for the Hawks. So if he can have a stretch where he is looking like a guy who could have star potential, which I don't think he'll ever reach, but he has shown flashes of that in the past. If he can show those flashes in a playoff series, that can take the Hawks far considering all the weapons that they already have offensively. For the Celtics, I unfortunately have to go with Kemba Walker. Last year in the playoffs, Kemba was disappointing offensively, and then you add on to it that he was horrible defensively, and that really hurt the Celtics. This year, while Kemba has been a lot better as of late, overall for the season, he has been very poor for the team. So him having a good series and not being bad like he has been this year and in the playoffs last year would make a big difference for the Celtics. And in fact, him having a good series would make a big difference because now that Gordon Hayward is out, the Celtics arsenal of weapons is not as big as it was. So you want something outside of just Jason and Jalen to go to offensively, and hopefully Kemba can be that. For the Miami Heat, the obvious pick here is Tyler Hero because Tyler is inconsistent. I'm kind of just saying the same thing here for all these players, like players that are inconsistent. Tyler is very inconsistent. He has games where he looks awesome. He had one of those games the other day, and he'll have games where he's like 0 for 9. Like, he needs to bring that consistency up before I'm confident giving him projections as a player for real. But as for a playoff series right now, he of course had that series versus the Celtics that was awesome, but then he followed that series with the Lakers series where he was very much not awesome. So it's definitely very well possible that he can win you a series or he could hurt you in a series. I won't say he lost them the Lakers series, but he didn't help. That's a real possibility with Tyler Hero, and he's the X factor for them because of that. For the Charlotte Hornets, I'm going to go with Miles Bridges. I don't have a huge, obvious pick here, but Miles lately has been on a tear. He's averaged, nearly 20 points per game ever since LaMelo Ball has been out, which is cool because a lot of people were spinning the narrative that Miles has made leaps because of Melo's playmaking, which sure, he's made a lot of highlight plays because of Melo's playmaking, but Miles himself has just been a lot better, and I'm just hoping that he can be that version of himself when LaMelo comes back come playoff time, if they do end up getting the playoff spot, which I believe they will. Miles, if he can still be like a guy who's getting 18 points per game on good efficiency while playing great defense, while still paired next to LaMelo Ball, in spite of the fact that there are less shots going around, that would make Charlotte a genuinely scary team because you have LaMelo, Terry, Gordon, and Miles, who are all capable of putting up 20 points on any given night, and even Devontae Graham, who can put up a 20-piece any given night. So that's a lot of offensive depth that he would bring to that team if he continues what he is doing right now when the team is fully healthy. For the Indiana Pacers, I'm going to go with TJ McConnell, not because he is necessarily inconsistent in that he has a lot of bad games and good games, but rather that he has some okay games, and then this is kind of similar to Kevin Huerter. He'll just have a really great game here or there. The other day he had, not the other day, a couple of games ago, he had an unbelievable performance that I had to highlight because he's one of the best backup point guards in the league. He's had a couple of 14, 15 assist games this year coming off of the bench, while also being a pretty decent scorer, all things considered. If he could average 8 assists per game off of the bench for this team, that could take them pretty damn far in a play-in situation and in the playoffs eventually. Oh, by the way, the Pacers are in the play-in territory. That's why I've gone to 9 teams now. And then finally, for the Washington Wizards, I'm going to go with Rui Hachimura. Rui is another player that can be inconsistent. He lately, I believe, has been averaging 18 points per game, but he can definitely be a pretty damn good scorer. His 3-ball is not the best, but he's a big forward with a really reliable pull-up mid-range shot, an ability to put the ball on the floor and finish at the basket. So if he can do that consistently, that's going to be a big deal. And then defensively, he has shown flashes of being really impactful. In general, I wouldn't say he's that good of a defensive player, but because he's a big, strong, fast guy, he can be really valuable as a help defender and even one-on-one against some of the bigger forwards in the league, but he's not consistent with that either. So a consistently good Rui Hachimura would make a big difference for the Wizards to win a play-in tournament and to make the playoffs in general, and to win a playoff series even, which not like they're actually going to do that, but if they did, that would be a big reason why, I think. So that was one X factor for every team. Again, there's a new podcast, so go check out that podcast if you have not already. Link is going to be in the description and in the pinned comment. That is the end of this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content like this, and cue the outro music.